Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 4 in poetry writing. This week, we're going to cover a lot of topics, and just to remind you, the goal of these PowerPoint videos is to help you have a supplement to your reading and thinking and assignments, to have our voice, my voice in here, guiding you through the learning, and to also cement some of the ideas and clarify things that you're reading in your text. Okay, so this week we are focusing on the line, which is this building block of a poem. If you think about the line, it's the thing that we write down in our journals when we read a line that we love, or we share it with someone else, or it sticks in our head and we repeat it to ourselves if it's memorable. So we want to write the sort of lines that not only create meaning in the poem and build, but are memorable and strong. And if we can create these strong lines, then together we can create a really strong poem. The Poetry Archive has some definitions of the line, and one is sort of just this subdivision of the poem, just sort of this really literal meaning, words arranged in a row that ends for a reason other than the right hand margin. So it's not like you're just typing till you get to the margin. You're choosing when to end it and start a new one. And then that line break where we press return or we put a slash, it's where the reader has to turn back to the start of the next line. And we call this a turn. So the reader is kind of going along and then the reader takes a turn. So we want the lines to feel that way, the line breaks, that when one line is ended and we're starting another one, we're taking a turn. The line is also supposed to be the length of a breath. Okay, so you can think about that. And maybe it's a long breath, maybe it's a short breath, but a breath indeed. Okay, the objectives of the line. So the first thing is to build. A line is a unit of composition. It's a way that you build a stanza. And then further on, we're going to be talking about stanzas and how stanzas act as paragraphs to build the poem, but the line builds the stanza. One of my favorite poets, Eduardo Corral, did a workshop at CCP one time, and he talked about the idea of the line hovering and propelling simultaneously, and I love this. You want the line to hover a bit, right? You want there to be something that you can kind of hold on to. So if we look at this poem here, Extinction, like a diseased lung, the city is shutting down. I kind of hover over this diseased lung in the line, right? It's kind of like that's the part that kind of catches you a little bit and you hover there a bit. Then you want the line to propel itself forward. So then here it keeps going, the city is shutting down. And you want to propel it into the next line, like why is the city shutting down? Here's this motion. And then we get to the next line. And the parks are first to go. We kind of hover over parks. We tend to hover over like images. And then we continue on with it. It continues to propel itself. So I think that could be a helpful way for you to think about the line, in that you want it to kind of stop and go at the same time. And the other beautiful thing about the line is that it's naive. The line doesn't know what comes next, right? So the grass is long-toothed and wicked. This line doesn't know that we're going to admit it's really not grass, it's weeds. And that there's sort of like that power in that naivety is really beautiful in reading poetry, but also for me, a lot of times when I'm writing a poem, I do not know what the next line will be. And that's what makes poetry a wonderful writing experience for me, because it's so revelatory. Like, I write a line and I have no idea what's going to come out of me next. And then when you see the next line, you're like, whoa, where'd that come from? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but there is that naivety of you're not sure what's coming next. This is a video that you guys can check out. It's in the PowerPoint of some expert poets talking about the line, which I recommend. And then here is just an example of a poem with shorter lines and then longer lines, and it's something you can take a look at to decide how is the meaning different in these two versions of the poem with the different spacings, with the different line lengths, with the different flow. How is it hovering and propelling? These are some examples to think about that in a little bit more depth. Same thing here. Here is Wordsworth's original. What I did is I sort of chopped it down a little bit. I made the lines shorter. Um, and you can see, like, even the first line, I wandered lonely as a cloud. If we read it, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on. It's different, right? Than I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills. The feel of it is different, the turn is different, the double meaning of the line breaks is different. So check this out and pay attention to this in your writing. Here is a place where you can pause and do an exercise. You look at a poem and notice your line breaks, and then relineate your poem by just inserting backslashes, or if it's on a screen, you can just, obviously create those new line breaks and just see how that changes meaning or emphasizes meaning. I was just working with a student on his poems, and he sent me a poem, and then he sent me a paragraph describing the poem, like the context of the poem. And I was like, whoa, this paragraph is a poem. So I took his paragraph and literally just made line breaks and cut out some words. And it was this beautiful poem. And we were talking about how it's amazing that the sentences mean one thing, and then you put some of the stuff on a line by itself, and it takes on this whole new life and meaning, which is the beauty of poetry. So try this. You could even try it with a paragraph. If you've written a paragraph that you feel maybe it's like a fiction or a screenplay or something, and you're thinking, this could be a poem, or this has some potential here, just try it. It's all about experimentation right now and figuring out, trying new things and figuring out what works for you. We're continuing our talk of music this week, and one of the things we're focusing on is this idea of sort of the formal poetry versus free verse poetry. Sometimes poetry is not metrical and not rhyming, and then what's the music in that? The music is the natural speech pattern. We all know this from music, from rap music, from spoken word. Even if it doesn't rhyme or have meter, there is this kind of musicality to the way that we speak. And rhyme and repetition help that. Words sing more than they say sometimes, right? They have this musicality to them. They might not be saying a lot, but they're adding to the music of the poem. One of the things for me as a writer, it has to sound right. My poetry, my academic writing, my fiction, my journalism, whatever it is, if it doesn't sound right to me and the rhythm is off, I have to change it. And sometimes people will suggest revisions to me that mess up the sound that I hear. I'm like, I can't make that revision because it will mess up the sound. And I need it to be this sound. So eventually you'll learn kind of what your sound is and what sounds good to you. But pay attention to that. The most important thing, if you want to use rhyme in your poetry, is to make it surprising, right? We shouldn't be able to guess the word that you're going to rhyme it with before we get to that word. It should come sort of like out of nowhere, but it also shouldn't be so abstract that it doesn't work with the poem, if that makes sense. So rhyming is really hard work. I don't tend to write a lot of rhyming poetry because it is so hard to write it well. And it sort of writing flows out of me in a non-metrical, non-rhyming way. Some of you, I know, it sort of comes out in that meter. You can hear it, you can feel it, and the rhyme is helpful to you to kind of get the ideas through and to help force the process of the writing, which is wonderful. Just keep that in mind. over time, the way that we write poems has changed a lot. And this newer way that we craft, a lot of people think it mirrors this idea of this imperfect world. The poetry before was so tight and perfect in its form. And now we're trying to write poetry that just sort of reflects whatever it is that we want to talk about, So keep in mind that the music of the poem and the form of the poem can match that as well. And then why is this important? I would like to make sure all of you read page 49. There's a little footnote there. And it's so important. I don't know, I just love that Koch adds this in the book because he's talking about like why we do this. And it's not like you have to know this to write poetry or read poetry, but as he emphasizes, it makes the writing better, it makes the reading better to know more of this information. You can just do a better job, even if you're not going to use music intentionally in your writing. It might help you in your revising, it might help you in your reading of other things. So I love that at the bottom, and he emphasizes why this is so important to us as writers. Another thing we're talking about this week is poetic inclination. This idea of like why do we write poetry, and what are some of the things that we feel propelled to do in our writing. It says poets have a tendency to exaggerate, to compare, to talk to things, and so on, in a way that escapes ordinary sense to some degree, in order to make sense of another kind. So sometimes we're kind of weaving through these trails, then people don't know where we're going, and then at the end they're like, So it's okay to feel like, to have that inclination in your writing, to kind of take a little detour and go around. I remember when I was in high school, my physics instructor wrote on the board A, B, and drew a line between the two and said, this is how the physics student walks to class. And then he said, this is how the poetry student walks to class. And he did like zigzags all over the board, and it took like the poet like 10 billion times as long to get to point B. But I think sometimes it's worth that little detour. To walk into a room in a mood for making comparisons is not like being there to make an inventory of its contents. Let that sink in for a minute. We are not listing the things that are there, but we are comparing all the things there to something else to bring deeper meaning to it. Okay, so good comparisons must be surprising and true, and they must not just stop there. Metaphors can be really powerful if you extend them beyond. So if you're going to say something is like something else, really break down all the qualities of both of those things and all the overlaps that you can find. Comparisons evoke emotion, and that's really important to think about. Is the comparison that you're using evoking the correct emotion of what you're trying to get across? We want to avoid cliches. We want things to feel fresh and new and surprising and like something we've never seen before but makes complete sense. Almost like, I've never seen that before, but I know that to be true. And metaphors have a little more power than similes, because they're saying one thing is another thing versus is like another thing. Here's an exercise you can do. You can pause. Personification and apostrophe. These are things that we can allow outsiders into the poem. We can affect our voice and tone. We can pull the abstract ideas into the concrete realm. Here are some other things to try, some exercises if you want to pause and do those. In writing, the lies and truths are important. The truth of feelings is more important than facts, but sometimes facts lead to feelings. So keep those two things in mind and in balance with each other. You're allowed to brag in poetry more than in real life. You're allowed to be vulnerable. That's what makes poetry great. Secrets and weaknesses are forgiven.